This morning, MPs have been questioning the bosses of payday lenders like Wonga, which charge high interest rates for short-term loans. Politicians have criticised the companies for charging too much and exploiting Britain's poorest households, a charge denied by the companies. But it shone a spotlight on the issue of how poor people manage their money. For example, what do you do to reach more than 1 million people who don't even have a bank account, and the many more who don't have a fully fledged current account? Here's Adam.
Money makes the world go around, but what if your bank won't trust you with a proper current account?
Most high street banks offer people on low incomes who've got bad credit scores so-called basic bank accounts. They're really no frills. They don't offer debit cards or standing orders, which means people can't take advantage of things like discounts on their utility bills for paying by direct debit.
Here in Sandwell, near Birmingham, 6Towns wants to solve that problem.
Good afternoon, 6Towns. How can I help?
It's a credit union, which means it's owned by its members, who effectively lend to each other. And this month, they'll become the first organisation of its kind to offer a fully fledged current account.
In many ways, it costs a lot to be poor. And part of the benefit in working with MasterCard on this service is that suddenly we'll be finding that people can access markets that currently are barred to them.
They also want to steer people away from legal but expensive sources of cash, like the payday lenders that line the high street here.
One particular man who had had a series of loans from a doorstep lender, he had paid over £3,000 in interest to a doorstep lender, and the equivalent amount of interest, if he'd have had loans from us over the same period of time, would have been about £250, £300. And he just looked at the figures that I gave him and he just burst into tears.
Some of those companies, like Wonga, have been in front of a select committee today. They say that most of their customers are happy with their service, and they've been misrepresented in the debate about how poor people manage their money. But that's a debate that's going to continue, because when the government's new universal credit is introduced, many benefit claimants will get their payments in monthly lump sums, rather than fortnightly handouts. The idea being it's more like being paid a wage. That's got some asking, how will people cope with something like a salary if they're not used to something as basic as a bank account?
Adam Fleming reporting. Well, we did ask the government for an interview with the Consumer Affairs Minister Jo Swinson, but she wasn't available. We have been joined, though, by her opposite number, Labour's Stella Creasy. Welcome back to the Daily Politics. Marion King, starting with you. MasterCard uses figures saying that 5.3 million people don't have a bank account. Yeah. I was quite stunned by that figure, actually.
I know, it's quite shocking in today's economy, but this is 5.3 million underserved or underbanked. Now, some people choose not to have a bank account, but for many, such as young people, those who've been out of work, unemployed, those trying to get back into work, it's very difficult for some to get a bank account.
5.3 million people. I mean, why does it matter so much that people have a bank account?
It's about social inclusion as well as financial inclusion. If you don't have a bank account, you can't use cards, you can't use electronic forms of payment, you can't buy on the internet, for example. The gentleman there highlighted, you can't use direct debit or electronic means of paying your bills.
I mean, you said there are different reasons. Some people can't get bank accounts, they've got a bad financial record. Who are the people that choose not to have a bank account? Why would they not want one?
Because they prefer to use cash. So maybe it's an element of trust, or maybe it's just a question of managing their money. What we're seeing increasingly is people drawing money from an ATM to spend before they go into a supermarket. It's a way of controlling their budget to make sure they don't overspend. Now, that being said, you can combine the two. So MasterCard can produce cards, prepaid cards, which are preloaded. You can't overspend on those cards.
And this is this basic account. This is a basic account that's not as flexible, obviously, as a basic current account.
Different. A basic account will bring with it a debit card, and that's what we've just done with 6Towns and other credit unions, providing a card that people can join the economy. What I was also talking about is you can also get prepaid cards which aren't attached to a current account, which enable you to spend electronically, safely, securely, so you haven't got cash in your pocket, but you can't overspend.
Do you think people need a bank account? I mean, should that be an aim of political parties to make sure people are included financially and socially by having bank accounts?
Well, of course, look, it was the last Labour government that set up the Financial Inclusion Task Force, and a number of the issues that Marion is talking about are absolutely right. The other point about this is the deals that you can access when you have a bank account.
Yeah.
I see people in my local community who are paying much higher rates for their energy, for example, because they're using prepayment meters. Yeah. Now, some of that has come down, but we're still seeing a huge, what I call a poverty premium by some of these issues. Interestingly enough, a lot of these payday lenders will make a virtue out of the fact they go to people with bank accounts. So a bank account in of itself doesn't necessarily guarantee that you'll get a fair deal, but it's certainly one of the ways that people are restricted to a fair deal.
But the problem is, Stella, because they haven't got bank accounts in, I would say, the vast majority of cases because they've had a bad financial record. They haven't been responsible with their cash. How are you going to persuade institutions like credit unions, like banks, to take on these people when they haven't shown any degree of responsibility with money?
Actually, that's not what the research shows. There's a really interesting study from the University of Birmingham, and they would query some of your figures, Marion. They would say it's more closer to kind of just under 1 million people who don't have a bank account, or possibly 2 million individual accounts. But I take your point, that's 2 million people too many, that we want to have access to that form of process.
Sure.
There are a number of different issues. There is a cultural issue, some of the things that Marion's talking about, people choosing not to have them, and there are people who have bad credit histories. But there is also a question here about the motivations of the banks and how they're assessing what a bad credit history is. And one of my concerns is we're increasingly seeing a segregation in our credit market, where for some people the only option they're able to have is payday lending or high cost credit, and as they take that out, then banks will judge them as not fit to lend to in other forms, and so it becomes worse, not better.
Yes, and I take that, but that's a failure of banks in the first instance, isn't it? They're only interested if they're going to make profits. That's what they're there for to a certain extent. But if you are cutting off so many millions of people, then how do you make the banks change their practices in terms of lending and setting up accounts for people who are on low-paid incomes?
Yeah, financial inclusion is critical. I totally agree with
But the banks aren't going to do anything about it, are they?
Well, I think we've seen the consequences of, responsible lending not happening. Irresponsible lending has led to the banking crisis across the spectrum, both domestically and, of course, in the bigger market.
Sure.
So we need responsible lending. Now, where people have a bad credit rating or they feel they're too high a risk, there are instruments that can be offered to those consumers, such as the prepaid capability, which doesn't require a current account. But if you use that card responsibly, i.e. you're not forever busting the limit, then that gives you a credit rating to enable you to get a basic current account. So there are tools out there.
We also have to look at some of the banks are not as wise as they'd like to say. We're seeing an increasing number of people who are going into their unauthorised overdrafts to pay off payday loan. Well, that's a win-win because the banks get the overdraft charges and the payday loans get their money from the Continuous Payment Authority.
But then it's about,
there is collusion here that we need to tackle too, because it's not a fair fight for the consumer.
Well, that's quite a serious charge on collusion.
Borrowing as well, and when we have to get that balance right. But there are instruments out there. There are, such as we saw with 6Towns, trying to help people who are on the lower income, and credit unions, charge 2% a month. So this is good low-cost lending.
Do you accept the reason that people turn to payday lenders, though, in order to get an amount of money, payday lenders say over a short period of time, is a failure of the banks?
No, I wouldn't. I think there's always going to be a market for short-term unsecured lending. Now, whether that's overdraft, whether it's a payday lender, there is a market there, there is a requirement there. What we need to make sure is that regulation is proportionate, that it's fair, that it's transparent, that consumers know what they're entering into and that the inappropriate practices that we've seen are not allowed to happen.
Right, I mean, there is a need in the market, isn't there? Otherwise, these companies wouldn't be doing as well as they are doing, and they say that on average, actually, it's people borrowing or taking out a loan for 17 days around the £175 mark. You'll be depriving people of a need.
This is absolutely why I want to reform that market, not end it. 80% of payday loans are for basics. This is people borrowing to put petrol in their car, to put food on their table, to pay their rent. It doesn't take a mathematical genius to work out when prices are rising 4 times as fast as wages, people are going to be short at the end of the month. That is slightly different from a short-term credit market that might deal with emergencies, say when your washing machine breaks down or when you need to get a new tyre. The point is, in this industry, all the incentives are about pushing people into debt. 50% of the profits come from default charges. They want to lend to people in ways that means they keep having to borrow from them. They keep being shorter and shorter each and every month. That is not a fair market for consumers. And therefore, it's right that we step in and say, what can we learn from other countries about using caps to change the incentives in this industry, to change the practice in this industry?
Well,
what we've seen today is some completely
without
irresponsible
caps and that sort of regulation that Stella Creasy is suggesting, you won't get the change.
Well, we've had this in the last conversation. Things like caps and freezes on their own don't work. They're blunt instruments. You've got to look at the whole industry. So it is about the type of loan, the length of loan. It is about the interest rate that they're paying, that it's fair and proportionate. It is about the practices in selling and recovering debt. It's all of those things. Just putting a freeze or a cap, as we've seen, causes unintended consequences
the reverse is
elsewhere.
true, Marion. With respect, without a cap, all these companies will do is recoup their prices by raising up the prices on any other affordability checks that you put in. And again, I want to see the banks and the credit card companies taking responsibility here too, because we've seen them put up their interest rates, put up overdraft charges, not listening to consumers who are really struggling right now, and a government that's let them off the hook for the last 3 years on this.
Final word.
Credit card company, MasterCard is not a lender. We do not lend money, as you know. We provide the mechanism that allows that transaction to happen. I think we need to be careful, because if you cap and suppress too much, what you do is you push the industry into the loan sharks.
From other countries. The evidence from other countries to the reverse is true.
I'm going to have to leave it there. Thank you.